Our IIA live webinar will be presented by Stephen James. Stephen has been involved in the information security and privacy profession since 1991. He has worked in PricewaterhouseCoopers, was a former associate director at the New South Wales Internal Audit Bureau, and is currently a director and general counsel at the Centrum Group. Okay, let's welcome Stephen into the conversation. Stephen, I'm just opening up your mic there and handing control over to you.
Thanks, Linda. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining to partake in the Auditing Data Privacy and Conducting Privacy Impact Assessments 1-hour webinar. So much to cover, so I'd like to jump into it straight away. This, out of interest, is a preamble to a full one-day course which the IIA has scheduled for, I think, the 25th of November in Canberra. So if you like the flavour of what you're going to hear today, please sign up, because I think there's only a handful of seats left. Canberra, 25th of November. Linda mentioned there are a number of polls, and we'll kick off with 3 of them, just so that I can help shape today's webinar. This one's an easy one. If you could please indicate if you're from private, public or NFP, just by clicking ABC that you'll see in the poll questions. The second poll question, again, just to help shape the webinar, is your location, or where you usually operate from. I think there are a number of international guests as well, in which case you would tick or click Other. Now, I wonder if this is a privacy breach. I'm asking for your authority, but you're not identifying yourself yet. We'll get into this. This will be an interesting case study. The third poll is, what are you? That sounds a bit gruff, but you know what I mean. What's your role? Are you an internal auditor, etc.? You might have a couple of responsibilities that you might like to click there. But importantly also, do you deal with health information? So I'll let...
Sorry, Stephen, I'm just going to...
Yes.
The results for the first polls come in, so if you wanted to just have a look at that. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to open up the second one as well. I think you've jumped ahead to the third poll, but these need to be done individually, so just bear with me. I'm just going to open up the second one as well. Thanks.
Rightio. There's the location one. I know these are really brief, but it is helpful just so I can see where everyone is, and if I need to focus on a particular state or territory's legislation, I'll do so. But the focus of today's will be the Commonwealth Privacy Act. You'll find that there's quite a bit of similarity often between state, territory and Australian government legislation, particularly when it comes to privacy. It looks like the poll is closed. It's like elections all over again. ACT will be fresh in your mind. So we'll wait for that poll. There we go. Other. All right. There's a lot of other, a lot of OS, but New South Wales, Queensland and Vic. Very good. And finally, this third poll, so that I can pitch this webinar from either an internal auditor's perspective, which I'll certainly do, but if there are privacy officers, legal counsel, risk managers, etc., I'll skew it towards you as well. So I'll let that run for a little bit. And from memory, the results of the first poll in terms of private-public sector NFP, I think it was about half-half private and public sector. And we're about to get the results of the third poll. What do you reckon? Internal auditors? The bulk? Yes. And risk managers and other. Rightio, thanks for participating in that. It will be helpful. I will skew and shape today's webinar towards that. But this is what we're going to cover. As I mentioned, it is a big topic. So today we'll just get a flavour about what data privacy is, what mandates it, what governs it in terms of legislative and regulatory requirements. We'll cover the privacy principles, all 13 of them, in summary form. So again, you get a flavour of it. I'll talk about privacy impact assessments, and this is important considering that we have so many internal auditors and risk managers. Whether internal audit conducts the PIAs themselves or ensures that PIAs are conducted when required, we'll cover those. And finally, what happens if a person's identifiable records, whether they're health records or not, is breached? What are the steps that any entity should go through to identify, perhaps even disclose the breach, and how to contain it through corrective and preventive action? All right, let's kick off with a brief video to talk about some of the problems that Aussie entities, private and public sector, face. This video is from YouTube. It was produced by Hitachi, but it was produced before the 2014 changes to the Privacy Act. But it gives a good introduction. So let's start with that, please.
In the digital age, businesses collect information from a variety of sources. For example, from customer relationship management software, correspondence via email, and discussions from help desk and telemarketing interactions. In the process, organisations amass considerable volumes of data every year. But with Australia's privacy laws changing, which type of information will be covered by the new legislation? Let's take a closer look. The 13 Australian privacy principles come into effect on the 12th of March. They describe how personal information is collected, managed, used, as well as discarded. The new definition covers information that singles out the individual from everyone else, even if the information does not disclose their identity. That's because electronic sources such as SIM cards on mobiles, cookies and IP addresses on browsers can be unique identifiers. New rules will also apply to unsolicited personal information. Organisations must take proactive steps to destroy or de-identify unsolicited information if it is not deemed reasonably necessary for one of its functions or activities. But many organisations find it difficult to navigate the changing regulatory landscape. In a recent survey of Australian businesses, over half of them admitted to struggling to keep up with legal changes. A quarter of respondents were unsure when they had undertaken the last information inventory audit to establish their current level of compliance. 45% of organisations had inconsistent workflows for privacy and data collection. Customer information was the most commonly cited data type subject to regulatory control, followed closely by financial and audit data. Marketing campaign as well as digital and social media ranked highly as well. Compliance is top of mind for executives, with more than 2/3 making it a priority over the next 12 months. So what actions can you take today? Start by assessing your organisation's state of compliance. Identifying what personal information you have is critical. Secondly, review your technology capabilities, as new hardware and software can automate processes and significantly ease the burden. Thirdly, educate employees about the new privacy principles and how their role helps protect personal information. And finally, appoint a privacy manager to drive this as an ongoing practice in your business. Download our new white paper to learn about the 4 easy steps to prepare your business for the changes ahead.
There we go. Hopefully everyone can hear me now. That video, as I said, was written before the changes to the Privacy Act, but the point is still very, very valid. And what we're going to do for the remainder of the webinar is dive a little deeper into that. But let's start with the introduction to privacy and the mandated legislation, the governing legislation. The key Aussie law which regulates personal information in terms of its collection, its use and disclosure is the Privacy Act of 1988. It's managed by the Office of the Australian Privacy Commissioner, and it covers PI, personal information, and that's information or even an opinion about an identified individual or an individual who could be identified. And you heard from that video that could include, for example, cookies on a web browser or a SIM card, etc. Anything, so it doesn't need to be your name and your address. It could be something that could be attributable or matched to you. And examples, the obvious examples include your name, your signature, your address, your phone number, date of birth, certainly medical records, your bank account details, TFN, all of those obvious things. But how about some of the less obvious things? Things such as commentary or opinion about a person, such as a person who's identified in a letter to the editor of the newspaper. How about photos, images, videos or audio footage? They're obvious, but what about CCTV footage within your own organisation? That's identifiable. Certainly fingerprints, blood and DNA samples. But there are, all of these are defined in the Act if you care to look, but they're the common examples of what personal information includes. There are some exemptions. So, for example, it doesn't include PI, personal information, about a person who's been dead for more than 30 years. It comes into the public domain. The Privacy Act includes 13 what's referred to as APPs, or the Australian Privacy Principles. And these set out the rules for collecting, for storing securely, completely and accurately, using, reporting, matching, etc., and disclosing of PI, personal information. We're going to go through each of the 13 in a little while. But let me point out one specific type of PI, and that is health information. I noticed that from the poll, a lot of people do deal with health information. And that includes details about a person's physical or mental health or their disability. And this could be personal information that you provide to a health organisation or to a health service provider, such as your GP or even your dentist, organ donation information, or certainly genetic information about you, your relatives, or your descendants. Health information is considered one of the most sensitive types of PI, personal information. So the Act provides extra protections around its handling. For example, an entity that collects health information generally needs your consent, an individual's consent, before they can actually collect it. We'll cover this again when we go through the 13 APPs. But who does the Privacy Act apply to? It applies to Australian government agencies, in other words, Commonwealth government agencies, and all private sector businesses and not-for-profits who turn over more than $3 million. But there are some exceptions. So even if you earn less than $3 million, you still need to comply. In these circumstances, it includes private sector health service providers, such as your traditional health service providers like private hospitals, day surgeries, GPs, pharmacists is another interesting one. It includes complementary therapists such as chiros, naturopaths, Interestingly, it also includes gyms and weight loss centres, as well as childcare centres and private schools and private tertiary educational institutions, including the ANU. But who is exempt? Who does it not apply to? It doesn't apply to state and territory public sector health service providers, such as hospitals, because they're covered by the state or territory acts. The Privacy Act also covers organisations that handle consumer credit reporting information, including those to whom you apply for credit, such as banks, even your energy and water utilities and telecommunications providers. It covers entities that deal with TFN, tax file numbers, old convictions, certainly my health record and healthcare identifiers. It includes businesses that explicitly sell or purchase personal information like mailing lists and so on. And importantly, contracted service providers, in other words, those who provide contracted services to Commonwealth government agencies, including their subcontractors. Just to sum up who it does not cover, it doesn't cover state or territory government departments because they're covered by their regional acts. It doesn't cover local councils because, again, they're usually covered by their state's privacy laws. It doesn't cover individuals. It doesn't cover public schools and unis, other than private unis like and the ANU. And it doesn't cover media organisations acting in the course of their journalism. And finally, it doesn't cover political parties and political representatives. It is important to comply, not just for the financial penalties that are imposed, but also because of reputational risk, loss of confidence and trust, etc. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about the importance of conducting privacy impact assessments. But interestingly, a breach of any of the APPs on or after they were introduced, the 12th of March 2014, the Act refers to it as an interference with the privacy of an individual. And usually we think it's a planned breach, such as sending out marketing materials, or we think of it as malicious theft or even hacking of databases and things like that. But it can also include unintentional breaches, errors, accidents that can arise from poor internal controls or failure to follow internal procedures, etc. For example, leaving a USB stick or a laptop on a bus, or sending an email to the wrong recipient with private PI information attached to it. We've all sent emails to the wrong recipient, but imagine if that included an attachment. I can see some questions coming through, and I'll bundle those up at the end. But for now, there's a question about WA. That's the question being, I didn't think WA had its own Privacy Act, and that's true. I'll do a rounds of the different states and territories in a minute, and I'll clarify that. But what are some of the financial implications? This could be a big stick, I guess, in bringing on board ownership and buy-in to the importance of privacy. The Information Commissioner has a range of enforcement powers, including the payment of compensation for damages, seeking civil penalties up to $340,000 for individuals, and up to $1.7 million for a company. It can apply enforceable undertakings, and it can seek an injunction as well. But the Privacy Act also interfaces with a number of Aussie Commonwealth laws which may have their own privacy obligations as well. I'll name a few. There are at least 10 of them. that the Telecommunications Act is one, the National Health Act, Data Matching Act, the Crimes Act, the AML, Anti-Money Laundering, and CT Financing Act, Counter-Terrorism Act, Healthcare Identifiers Act, and so on. So there's a number of provisions in other legislation, but the Privacy Act is the key one. I promised to do a quick round of the different states and territories. Let me do that now. Let's start with Queensland. Queensland has the Information Privacy Act, which regulates personal information, including health information, for the Queensland public sector. New South Wales has two key privacy acts, and they are the PIP Act, the Privacy and Personal Information Protection Act, in other words, any identifiable record that is not health information. Health information is covered under a second act, which is the HIRIP Act, the Health Records and Information Privacy Act, and it's the New South Wales Information and Privacy Commissioner that oversees those. The ACT only recently, well, 2014, introduced the Information Privacy Act, which regulates the handling of personal information by ACT public sector agencies. But it has had the Health Records Privacy and Access Act for quite a while, I think 98, 97, somewhere around there, and that, as the name implies, regulates the handling of health information. Victoria is also fairly recent. They introduced the Privacy and Data Protection Act in September 2014, and that covers all personal information, again, other than health information, but it also sets out protective data security requirements required of the public sector in Victoria. Just as an aside, some unashamed marketing, in conjunction with IIA Victoria, we're holding a special briefing session for Victorian government departments and what they can do to comply with the PDP Act. Health records in Victoria falls under the Health Records Act of 2001. Tassie has the Personal Information and Protection Act, and South Australia, like WA, so I'm answering the WA question, doesn't have any specific privacy legislation, but government agencies need to comply for South Australia with a set of information privacy principles, and you can find that in PCO 12, which is an instruction on information privacy. In addition to that, health records are covered under a Code of Fair Information Practice. WA, like South Australia, doesn't have, or at present doesn't have privacy legislation, so that answers that question, but there are various confidentiality provisions that bind government agencies, and some of the privacy principles that they're bound to are set out in the FOI Act, which is overseen by the Information Commissioner of WA. Also, the Health and Disability Services Complaints Office handles complaints relating to health and disability services. NT, I think we have a handful of people from NT. You have the Information Act of 2003, and that handles both personal and health information. That is a quick tour. Just being mindful of time, I would like to cover the 13 APTs, and I've summarised it in this diagram here. They're the main topics. Let me quickly go through this. Now, these, as you've heard, changes in legislation occurred in 2014, and these 13 APTs were introduced to streamline what was previously the National Privacy Principles and the Information Privacy Principles. You can find them at Schedule 1 with a description in more detail than I'm going to cover in the Privacy Amendment Act of 2012. And these set out how an in-scope entity, which are referred to as an APT entity, and we covered who's covered by the Privacy Act. I'm calling them in-scope APT entities, they describe the rules or for the collection, the use and disclosure of personal information. They're not prescriptive, they're just principles. And this means that an APP entity needs to determine how best to apply them within their own environment. Perhaps have an existing management system or a compliance management system that they can integrate it into. Rather than building another set of red tape, these things are best embedded into workflows by defining them into day-to-day work instructions rather than having a separate set of a separate management system, if you like. Let's quickly cover the 13. APP1 requires that personal information be managed openly and transparently. See, it's a principle. But what does that actually mean? Well, from observation, in practical terms, this means that an organisation should have, at the very least, an APP privacy policy. And that policy needs to be made available for free and in an appropriate form. But what makes a good privacy policy? We'll cover this in more detail in the one-day course, but let me give you a few observations. It should cover what kind of personal information the entity collects and holds, how it collects it and holds it, for example, through an online form, through telephone interviews, directly at a GP, etc. Why it collects the information could be as a primary function of the entity under legislation or otherwise. It should include how a person can access their own personal information and how they can have it corrected, which is another APP in terms of quality and completeness and accuracy that we'll talk about in a second. It should also summarise how a person can complain about a breach and an outline of the entity's management of privacy breaches. Importantly also, it should address and list what overseas countries the entity is likely to disclose the personal information to. We'll talk a little more about cross-border dissemination of personal information. APP 2 requires individuals to be given the option of not identifying themselves or using a pseudonym, but there are some exceptions to this. For example, where the entity is required or authorised under law to deal with individuals who have identified themselves. Health is a good example under specific legislation. Or where it's impractical to deal with individuals who haven't identified themselves or who've used a pseudonym, so long as it can be related to the primary objective or the function, primary purpose of the collection. APP 3 requires that collected information must be reasonably necessary or directly related to the entity's functions or activities. For sensitive information, such as health records, the individual's consent is required. So a health organisation can collect information if it's set out in their governing act. For example, cancer-related information to collect in the national database, state and territory-based databases, and the Act also allows certain in-scope entities to collect that directly from a GP or a pathology laboratory as well, for example in New South Wales. One of the new APPs that were introduced with the last set of changes is dealing with unsolicited personal information. So things that you haven't asked for that people have provided to you that is identifiable about them. Where an entity does receive information like that, it needs to assess whether it would have been permitted to collect that information under APP3. Remember, that's about the entity's primary function. If it can prove that, I guess, then some of the protective measures that we're about to cover in APPs 5 to 13 need to be applied. But if the information could not have been collected for the primary purpose, and the information is not already contained in a public record or Commonwealth record, then the entity needs to destroy it or at least de-identify it. APP5 requires an entity to notify the individual of certain things when they're collected, such as who the entity is that's doing the collection, specifically what's being collected under what authority, whether that's an act or otherwise, the purpose for the collection, and a copy of the entity's privacy policy. Importantly as well, whether or not that personal information will be disclosed to an overseas body. APP 6 requires an entity to only use or disclose that personal information for its primary purpose or for a secondary purpose if an exception applies, and the Act sets out those exemptions such as the individual consents or the individual would reasonably expect the entity to use or disclose it for that purpose, or if the entity is required to collect it under legislation or an enforceable order, such as from a tribunal. We all get unsolicited marketing, phone calls and emails and things like that, and APP7 protects us from that and says that an entity can't use or disclose personal information for direct marketing unless it was collected directly from us, from the individuals. So, for example, if you explicitly sign up to a mailing list on a website, sign up to Coles or Woolworths weekly specials, for example, or Aldi, and if we or the person is given an easy opt-out, to stop being mailed these annoying things, press unsubscribe, and if the entity actually does unsubscribe, I don't know about you, they don't always. This actually goes hand in hand with a number of other acts that provide other protections, such as the Do Not Call Register, the Spam Act, etc. APP8 is about disclosing information to overseas entities and sets out when an entity can do that and when it can't. In brief, it can do it if the individual consents or if it's required under law or if there is an international agreement between Australia and the overseas entity. APP9 actually forbids an entity from adopting, using or disclosing a government-related identifier such as a Medicare number as its own identifier unless one of the exceptions apply, and you can find those exceptions in APP9. APP10 requires an entity to take reasonable steps to ensure that PI that it collects, uses and discloses is complete and accurate. So I guess this is to avoid making impactful decisions based on wrong information or incomplete information or even dated information. This is particularly important for healthcare, as you can imagine. So as auditors, risk managers, etc., this is where our traditional IT application controls come in. Completeness and accuracy of data. This is also where data migration techniques come in, where the initial database is populated perhaps it's an upgrade of a system or a change of system. And this is also where we need to ensure appropriate data governance controls, particularly in relation to data quality. This ties in with APP 13, which I'll jump to now, and I'll jump back to 11, but APP 13 requires an entity to take reasonable steps to correct personal information upon request. So if an individual asks for their own records to be corrected, if the entity needs to take reasonable steps to make sure that that happens. APP 11 is an important one. This is all about protecting the, I guess I'm paraphrasing, but protecting the security over the data. The Act actually refers to it as protecting information from misuse, interference, loss, unauthorized access, modification, disclosure, etc. But really, it's data security. In its broadest sense, it's not just a breach of confidentiality, it's also data availability, the traditional triage of data security being confidentiality, integrity, and availability. It specifically requires reasonable steps to be undertaken to prevent data loss. As internal auditors, risk managers, etc., we would be looking for things such as technical controls, IT controls, as well as non-technical operational controls, policies, procedures, etc. On the IT side, that would be network layer defenses, server hardening, patching, application role-based access controls. It would include data backups for availability, tested, demonstrable IT recovery plans, so on and so forth. And the last one, because I've already spoken about APP 13, APP 12 requires an entity to give individuals access to their own personal information upon request unless certain conditions are in play, such as if releasing that information would pose a serious threat to life, health, safety, etc., if it would affect adversely the privacy of others, whether it is a frivolous or vexatious request, that's also covered, and also whether giving access would prejudice negotiations or legal proceedings. These are pretty much in line with Commonwealth, State and Territory freedom of information related legislation, for example in New South Wales, the GIPA Act. That is a quick whirlwind tour of the 13 APPs. You can see they're pretty common sense. There's nothing ridiculous, I personally don't think, in having worked in this field for quite a while now. There are some good principles that are set out there, but let me point you to some further details, and hopefully this will cover some of the questions that have been asked, such as CCTV footage, where does it actually say that, and competing, or I guess, competing state territory requirements. Let me answer that by playing this video straight from the Information Commissioner's mouth himself.
Hello, my name is John McMillan and I'm the Australian Information Commissioner. You may know that significant changes to the Privacy Act will commence on 12 March 2014. A key change is the introduction of the Australian Privacy Principles, the APPs. The APPs replace the existing information privacy principles that apply to Australian government agencies and the national privacy principles that apply to many private sector businesses and not-for-profit entities. The APPs will closely reflect the personal information life cycle, from notification that personal information is being collected, through the collection, use and disclosure of that information, the secure maintenance of high quality information, and access to and correction of personal information. The Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, or OAIC, will monitor compliance with the APPs. As part of that, we've developed the APP guidelines. These guidelines are an essential tool for all entities that are covered by the Privacy Act. They outline the mandatory requirements of the APPs, how the OAIC will interpret the APPs, and matters we may take into account when exercising functions and powers under the Privacy Act. The guidelines also give many examples of how the APPs apply in particular circumstances, and they contain suggestions for good privacy practice. In short, the guidelines span the minimum compliance requirements through to best practice guidance. The OAIC developed the APP guidelines in consultation with business, government, peak bodies and the public. We received many submissions and a strong call for practical examples and clarification on the difference between mandatory requirements and best practice, and the principles and objectives that will guide the OAIC in its monitoring and compliance work. As a result of the feedback, we've clarified the language around the Privacy Act and APP requirements that are mandatory, the musts, the additional matters the OAIC may take into account in deciding what is standard or reasonable business practice, the shoulds, and best practice guidance that rises above minimum compliance, the coulds. I'm delighted to announce that the APP guidelines are now finalised and are available to read or download from the OAIC's website. As we approach 12 March, it's exciting to finalise this next step in privacy law reform. The OAIC has already published a large number of resources to help you with the transition, and there are more to come. So I encourage you to visit our website, www.oaic.gov.au, to learn about the changes as they happen. I look forward to working together to ensure excellent privacy practice in Australian government and business. Thank you.
So the guidelines you'll find on the oaic.gov.au website. The video you can find on YouTube. To search Information Commissioner Australian Privacy Act. So Shanti, the guidelines oaic.gov.au, but we'll see if we can make them available directly after this. Pleasure. Let's talk about privacy impact assessments. I'm not sure how many entities actually embed this into their work practices. I do know, working very closely with a number of health entities, at least in New South Wales, that they are embedded, and that is a really good thing. Remember that APP1 requires entities to take reasonable steps to comply with the APPs, and we spoke about the one way of doing that is to publish easy to read, easily accessible privacy policies, but another way is to conduct privacy impact assessments. APP1, when you read the guidelines for further information, actually talks about privacy by design, and that really means embedding the controls in from the very start of a, let's call it a project, rather than, very much like information security, rather than retrospectively at the end discovering that, oops, we've got an exposure here, let's plug the hole. That can be really tedious, costly, re-engineering systems, etc. So if you do a PIA, a privacy impact assessment, that I'll talk about in a second, you can help ensure that privacy compliance is done by design from the start. And so when should a PIA be undertaken? Well, PIAs are intended to be undertaken for a project, and when we say a project, it's really an initiative or any type of activity not just an IT project, any type of project, like the publication of a new type of report, anything that has the potential to incur a privacy implication. It could include, for example, a new data collection that your entity wishes to undertake, collecting information from the public, collecting information from employees, and so on. It could be sparked off from new or amended legislation. Certainly for an IT project, it could be as a result of a change in the way your entity stores information. It's a little like a risk assessment in that the first step is to essentially map out the flow of information associated with this project as we've defined it, and to look for any potential exposures along that data flow, to look for risk areas, if you like. And the body of a PIA actually goes through the 13 APPs to see what controls are either planned or currently in place. And the outcome of the PIA is just like an internal audit report, coming up with recommendations, either corrective or preventive actions for future. And this all helps to embed privacy from the very start. A quick user guide for privacy impact assessments. Again, if I can point to the oaic.gov.au website, there is a good summary format there. Why should you do one? Well, for compliance, obviously, but I think from experience here, there's a bigger benefit. It helps your entity to demonstrate to its stakeholders, which could be the community at large, that you take this seriously, that it can help to undermine a project. If privacy is not controlled from the start, if a breach occurs, then that project is likely, and your entity as a whole, is likely to suffer reputational and trust repercussions. But a PIA is also a good way of demonstrating compliance and can assist with a future investigation if required. It is not mandated, so the Act doesn't say you must conduct one, although the OAIC, the Information Commissioner, can direct an agency to conduct a PIA, particularly if there is significant inherent risk to people's privacy. It's really a 10-step process. I've listed the 10 steps there. I'm going to cover some of the more critical ones. Threshold assessment, that is one of the important ones. It's basically a triage, determining whether or not you need a full-blown privacy impact assessment. So if the project, as we've defined what a project is, if the project doesn't deal with personally identifiable information, then it's likely that you don't need to conduct a full PIA. But you still can, just in case something goes wrong later. But the very first step, every project or initiative should at least include a triage, what we call the threshold assessment. If you deem, after doing that, a PIA is required, I will point out item 5, mapping out the information flows. Just like an internal audit, it's a process flow. Some people call it a risk and controls matrix, where you might come up with a flow chart of a process for accounts payable, for example, and then identify the risks and the controls you anticipate to find in there. This is very similar. You map it. Diagrammatic way is best to do that. I'll also point out item 6, which is the compliance check. This is the guts of the PIA. This is going through each of the 13 APPs one by one, and if it's a project that's still being developed, it's determining whether controls have been planned. And I would suggest a pre-implementation review as well, or at the very least a post-implementation review to make sure that what was planned is actually in place. No doubt, as we are generally internal auditors, we will come up with some opportunities for improvement, and they can be linked back to the risk management definitions of the entity itself so that everyone understands what the impact and likelihood and the residual risk means in comparison to other risks of the entity as well. The last point that I'll draw out is number 10, the review. When you look at the OAIC methodology for privacy impact assessments, which really is in line with what I'm explaining here, it talks about the ongoing element of the PIA. So it shouldn't just stop, it should be continual monitoring. So even after the project is implemented, there could be changes to the way data is collected. So a privacy impact assessment, at least of the relevant APPs that pertain to the collection of information, should be reperformed. I'll make one more key observation here. Who should be doing this? Certainly, it should have a team of relevant stakeholders, and primarily that's going to include the data owner, or in some cases the data custodian. It could include IT, it should include internal audit and risk management, sometimes legal counsel as well, and certainly the audit risk committee should be briefed, and similarly the executive group should be briefed as well. That is the essence of a privacy impact assessment. If you ask me, it's a little like a risk assessment, it's a little like a compliance check, but it's the best of both. The final topic, even after we put in all of these preventive measures and even the detective measures, things still happen. Just like information security, a breach can occur. So what are the key things that we've seen in the recent past? Well, just watching the news, they love to highlight accidents such as leaving USB keys on trains, laptops, etc., particularly where the laptop is not password protected and sensitive data is not encrypted. It could be stolen laptops from work, or even mobile phones, particularly if personal information is emailed as an attachment. If someone obtains a phone, there is the information as well. It could be as a result of security breaches, hacking, for example, or accidental disclosures, someone not following proper procedure, or naughty staff members, for example, they look up their neighbours' details and so on. But what steps should we be looking for? What framework should we be looking for as internal auditors and risk managers? Well, there's a four-step approach. The first thing that we would want to make sure is that there are processes in place to contain the breach. So a breach has been identified. How do we stop it from getting worse and worse? And this could be disconnecting the IT system if it is a data breach, but not to the extent where it impacts on the integrity of evidence, for example. It's all about maintaining the integrity of the evidence as well. It's conducting a risk assessment to determine the best path forward for remediating, putting in CAPAs, corrective preventive actions. Should the breach be notified, sometimes it serves the organisation well to do so. You have probably read that the ALRC, the Law Reform Commission, is pushing for mandatory disclosure of data breaches. I know everyone has their own personal view on that, but certainly the AIC could be notified. If it is a criminal act, then certainly law enforcement should be notified, and your stakeholders, including the affected parties, whether that's the community or other people, could be notified as well. And you've seen examples, Dropbox, Google, all the big names, they have disclosed data privacy breaches and data security breaches. In terms of, and certainly just like any other type of incident response, it's coming up with controls to prevent future breaches as well. If it is a IT breach, then it could be, for example, hardening the service, applying better segregation of duties so that person A can't look at records that don't pertain to their work responsibility. It could be patching IT systems and so on. Another interesting technology that's fairly new, 2, 3, 4, 5 years old, is something called data leakage prevention tools. It is a IT appliance, as they call it, that sits on the network, or it can work with particular databases, particularly email systems, that can look for keywords and identify whether or not it contains PI or health records, and then based on predefined business rules, it can either block that data from being sent out or copied onto a USB. But usually it's emailed or file transferred to Dropbox or some other destination, or it could simply just warn and say, look, are you sure you want to send this? And it can send, it will certainly keep an audit trail as well. So dealing with data breaches is very much like any other type of incident, other than for the emotive element of it as well. And I guess the ethical and moral responsibilities of an organisation when it comes to things such as health records and other sensitive information of that ilk. So, what a big topic. I do note some of the questions, especially a link to the OAIC's guidelines. So I'm happy to provide that. Linda, I'll work with you afterwards to find out the best way of sending that information out. But let me just summarise some of the key points. It's the Privacy Act, that's the key Aussie law, and it applies to Commonwealth government agencies, private sector businesses and not-for-profits who turn over greater than 3 million, with some exceptions, such as the private health sector service providers, even if they earn under 3 million. The Privacy Act does not apply to state and territory public sector health service providers, such as public hospitals, local councils, etc. They're covered by their own state and territory acts. A breach of the APP can be very costly, financially and otherwise, up to 1.7 mil for companies, dollar-wise, but it's the reputational impact and the loss of trust that can really hurt. The 13 APPs, they're not prescriptive, they're principles, and it is left up to an organisation to determine how best to apply them. A good starting point is a policy, and as an internal auditor and risk manager, conducting, I suppose, your own broad PIA against the 13 APPs to determine the level of current compliance. A PIA is strongly recommended, at least the threshold assessment to determine whether or not a full PIA is required. And the benefits are greater than just compliance. It also helps to demonstrate to the community that you're serious about it. Privacy breaches, unfortunately, are on the rise. And it's likely that we will hear more and more of these as we become more and more connected, and as the Internet of Things, the IoT, that is a buzzword for the connectivity of our day-to-day technologies, not just computers, but things like your car, your phones, your fridges, etc. Over the years, we will see more and more of that, and they will give rise to inherent risks associated with data privacy breaches. And if you would like to find out more and dig a little deeper into this, you are welcome to come along to the one-day course, IIA Canberra chapter, 25th of November. May I please get your feedback just to see which of these 4 topics that we covered was of most interest to you. Was it conducting privacy impact assessments? Was it how to deal with privacy breaches? Keeping in mind, I suppose, that the majority of us here are from internal audit. Some of us carry a dual role, IA and RM, risk management. I would be interested to know. So Linda, I will work with you and seek your advice on how to best disseminate the OAIC's guidelines, which I have as a PDF, but it's a big document, so maybe I'll just give you the link.
Yeah, no problems. No, if you did have that PDF, we can easily attach it with the recording email that's going to be scheduled to be sent out within 24 hours. So if you wanted to edit, or if it's a very large document, we can easily just, send out the relevant pages.
Right here. Okay.
Now, just closed up, that poll results just popped up open for you as well.
Yes, thanks for that. That's good feedback. So conducting the privacy impact assessment. If that's the case, I'll also point everyone, I'll try and download it as a PDF, but I'll also at least point you to where you can find further information on how to conduct a PIA, which isn't rocket science, you'll see. Easy to do, but let me actually, one important thing came to mind. The PIA, I believe, should be integrated into an organisation's project management methodology. Make it a mandatory gateway check, just like a security risk assessment or a business impact assessment, and not just IT projects, any project. Good. Thank you all. That should read just the 25th of November. I hope to see you in Canberra. It will be beautiful in November in Canberra, as it always is. Thank you kindly for your attendance.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Stephen. That was an excellent session. Also, a special thanks to our delegates there for their participation, as well as for everyone's attendance today. It was really, really good to see all of the questions also come through as well. Now, if anybody does have any last-minute questions, can I ask for you to just quickly pop it into the chat box now? However, if you are ready to leave us now, to exit, please click on that cross on the top right of your screen. As you exit, you will be redirected to a feedback form. Now, the feedback form only takes about 30 seconds to complete. However, feedback is really beneficial for the IIA as well as Stephen. Also mentioned in today's webinar, the PDF document that Stephen was referring to will be included in your recording email. Now, for those who could not view today's videos, just letting you know that we'll also edit it into the recording, which you'll receive sometime within the next 24 hours. Okay, just having a look at the chat box there, Stephen. Just a lot of thank yous. So thank you, everyone, for taking the time to write that. Let me just have a look. I'm just having a quick look to see if there's any questions there. Now, Philip did ask a question, and the question is, what has been the largest fine so far? I'm not sure if I missed what the topic that you were referring to, but did you want to answer that one there?
Yep. Great. Yeah, sure. Some organisations have been hit with the full 1.7 mil. I don't know about individuals, though. Individual being hit with up to 340K, but certainly companies have. But the real impact to them is greater than 1.7 mil, as you can appreciate. Sometimes, though, interestingly, the fact that they've disclosed it actually helps improve their reputation and trust, so long as they can demonstrate that they are on a path of continual improvement, of course. It won't happen again, etc.
Great, thank you, Stephen. Now, Veronica also asked a question earlier on. I'm not sure if you've answered it, but she wrote, I remember seeing a guideline on how to manage a data breach notification. Can you please send that through?
Yes, good point. Okay, I'll look that up as well. So there are 3 PDFs that I'll chase up, which are the guidelines, which is the PIA and data breach. These are all suggestions, by the way, except for the guidelines. The others are just suggested approaches. I'll make that available through you, Linda.
Yeah, no problems. Thank you very much, Stephen. Okay, there's nothing further. Are you just happy to conclude there, Stephen?
Yes, thank you for that. Thank you, everyone.
Excellent. Thanks once again for presenting there. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to pop on the music as you all exit. But like we said, all of those materials relating to today's topic will be available in the recording email. Okay? I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks.